We are back from the CCS 10K this past weekend. TFM went down to hang out, participate in the weekend, kind of give a little bit support to third-party organizers, but also get that experience and get those reps in for the last chance qualifiers and NACC in total. It was a great weekend. There was lots to be discussed about that weekend. We have breakdowns from that tournament and from other tournaments around, along with a full breakdown of registered decks, which I think is very interesting to note. And then, of course, we have the full breakdown of the top 8 of CCS, the top cuts from the 10K, 72-player tournament, and then also a 119-player tournament that was also held at CCS. There were two different events. So let's get right on into the decks today, look at the breakdowns, and then we'll discuss some of the decks of success this weekend. So this is the Week 5 meta breakdown, and these are the registered decks in tournaments. So these aren't the winning decks, but this is what the metagame looked like when you walk into a tournament and you're kind of looking around the room and you're seeing what's the most played. So you can see here there are 63 registered Ruby Amethyst decks, 49 Amber Steel, 49 Amethyst Emerald, 40 Ruby Sapphire, 25 Amethyst Steel, 18 Emerald Steel, 13 Sapphire Steel, and then we keep going past that. Some of the notable things here is we went from last week where Ruby Sapphire was the most registered deck in EUCC to falling down to 4th place. Ruby Amethyst, with that win last weekend, took a huge jump in success of overall registered decks. Amber Steel kind of staying the same. Amethyst Emerald taking a bit of a jump, specifically when most of the tournaments that are being reported on here are from the North American side. So still lots of entry from Amethyst Emerald players. Amethyst Steel, Emerald Steel, and Sapphire Steel all lingering on the outskirts now in the top 5. Obviously, Amethyst Steel a little bit more higher registered than the Emerald Steel and Sapphire Steel, but then the other trickling in numbers are just kind of like a few different concepts of decks, but none of which were all too successful. There was an Amethyst Sapphire deck that we're going to look at that was in a top 8 of the CCS 2K on Sunday. But all in all, this was a pretty nice breakdown for the weekend, and this is really starting to shape up to what the decks you can assume will start showing up at NACC and, of course, Set Championships next month. Taking a quick look at the CCS top 8 breakdown, there were 5 Amber Steels, 1 Ruby Sapphire, 1 Amethyst Steel, and 1 Ruby Amethyst. So with that, you can see that there was a dominant performance of Amber Steel at the event. Now, when Ruby Amethyst is the most played and the lingering other decks or other steel decks, on average, Amber Steel will be successful in those metagames. Ruby Sapphire, while being a pretty highly registered deck along with Ruby Amethyst, it didn't have the greatest conversion rates at CCS. So that is something to be noted here, that even though Amber Steel traditionally has a bad matchup in a Ruby Sapphire, there's a new version of Amber Steel that is showcasing its strength into Ruby Sapphire decks. Now we're going to be looking at one of those decks from the top 8. Without that, there's your top 8 breakdown. Let's get into some decks. So here's Kendall played to a top 4 of the CCS 10K, the 219-player tournament. This was the only Ruby Amethyst deck to make top 8. The cool thing about Kendall's run is over on the Lore 20 Pro stream, they actually streamed the majority of Kendall's matchups, if not all of them. I didn't go through and watch the stream yet because I was actually participating in the event, so I didn't actually see, but I know that he was in the feature match area the whole time. So you can actually go and watch Kendall play his entire tournament all the way to a top 4 run, I believe. This deck is pretty close in similarities to what we've been seeing recently in Ruby Amethyst decks. The key takeaway here is there is still a Dragonfire, but no Maui Half Shark. We also see the resurgence of Maui's Fishhook. I think this is a card that's pretty dominant right now in the metagame, specifically if you're still playing Maui's. Also, if you're going to be playing Maui Demigod and Maui Sharks, having just a little bit more increase of range of cards that can interact with this is pretty formidable. Giving any character evasive or giving your evasive characters plus strength, very relevant in the Genie Wars going on right now. Definitely helps for trading up with cards like Turnibogs and Brooms and Rabbits and things like that when necessary. But even just having a Genie on 4 into a Maui on 5 can basically tell you that your Genie can one-shot opposing Genies, which is a pretty big deal. Having the splits of Lady Tremaine, Medusa, and Sisu in varying numbers is just showcasing the depth in which Ruby removal still exists. Of course, we're still riding the coattails of Flynn Rider and Sisu, even though they might not necessarily be the greatest cards that you always want. They're still dominating when going first and have the presence to help you catch up later on in the game to quickly gain 3 lore burst. Later on, as the game goes on, even a turn such as Flynn plus Bell can really stabilize you and representing 6 lore a turn. So this is a really well-designed deck by Kendall here. A successful weekend finishing in the top 4. I believe he said this is his third top 4 in a row, so he hasn't been able to get into the CCS win, but 3 top 4s in a row is definitely above average for any card player, and I'm sure that Kendall's pretty happy about that. Let's take a look at this Amber Steel aggro deck played by Alex. This deck finished in top 8, but it was one of the only 6-0 decks going into the final rounds of the tournament, where Alex drew and then lost in the final round to finish 8th instead of 1st. Just kind of the way the breakers went down and of the way the tournament played out, Alex was positioned better that he could not finish any worse than 8th. So he played in the final round and lost to the Steel Fossil list that was in top 8. But this is still one of the better decks in the room on Saturday. So, what is this deck offering that other Amber Steel decks aren't? Well, first and foremost, this is not a whole new world deck. This is an aggro dock list, but it's also utilizing some new characters. Having the Zimba, which is the 5 cost 4/4 lore shift 3, and with the ability to ready all of your exerted characters aside from Zimba, is a pretty big deal. What this does is that it protects your singers quite well. It protects your 2 lore and 3 lore characters very well, such as piglets and things like that. We also had a lone John Silver in this list to protect some of your piglets and things like that early. This is another very aggressive list that has these corner pin cards that are really just all playing a role. While this list looks like a bunch of ones and twos, all of the role players here have a point, which is what I think defines this list. In some of the other lists that were in top 8, you had seen more four ofs and less diversity. And sometimes consistency is great in those numbers. But in a deck that has so much depth and choice, it doesn't hurt you if a lot of the cards do similar things and have the ability to put you ahead in gameplay. Having cards like Sven and Pluto as different options that kind of do the same thing, but each represent different amounts of lore is pretty important. Having a 5/5 when necessary is great. Having a 3/3 with 2 lore that readies another 2 lore character, also very powerful. Still playing cards like Beast Tragic Hero is a pretty interesting choice, but there aren't that many Zeuses in the format. There also aren't that many Medusas in the format anymore, seeing as most lists are going down to 1 or 2 Medusas in their Ruby decks. So there's a lot of variety and choice here, and really just giving yourself a ton of ways to interact with the board. This deck played well. It was one of the 5 Amber Steel decks in the top cut of CCS. All in all, played incredibly well, finished strong, and just lost on mostly because of a die roll and top 8 more than anything. Huge shout out to Alex for finishing in the top 8 this past weekend. Congrats. Can't wait to see you at Continentals. Tristan was the lone Amethyst Steel in top 8 this past weekend at the CCS 10K. This Amethyst Steel list has been really just popping up over and over again. It's shown consistency through 3 or 4 weeks now, I believe, where a version of this list has been up there and been successful within bigger tournaments. So finding a way into the top 8 is a pretty massive statement that this list is up for debate as one of the better Amethyst Steel decks within the format. Having the pretty standard aggro start with the 16 1-drops, followed by the Calhouns and Smees on your 2. There are no snakes in this list. We still have crabs, which is, I think, a really interesting note for the aggro and more aggressive versions of Amethyst Steel, is that although you, on average, want to be able to play a very aggressive game, a card like Crab really creates necessity because you have to have a way to win on the draw. And games that are being played right now, when you look at this list, you're like, oh, my characters are Maleficents, Brooms, and Diablos on turn one on average, because they're three of the four of your choices. They just can't trade very favorably with any characters. So being able to still put one of those in play, and then on turn three, crab a Diablo or crab a Broom, and then trade with a character when you're behind, I think is a pretty big deal. And it's definitely a way to create versions of this deck that can win on the draw. Genie and Elsa as your top end ways to kind of like win those Genie Wars and just create evasive threats. Yzma is an interesting card. It's still a card that I'm not very much a fond of at all. In all honesty, every Yzma that I played against this weekend certainly did not get to exert and draw any cards. I was able to banish it each and every single time. I really dislike the idea of paying for a card that may never do anything and doesn't get you anything on play. So this is a card that personally I would remove from this list very quickly. Gantu is another character. I think that the anytime that we're paying 5 to exert to hope that we get 4 lore, we're just hoping, and I'm not a huge fan of those things either. Although this list is successful, it's not to say that there aren't ways to build this without cards that are needing your opponent to just sit back and do nothing. I think both of those cards are putting yourself in a really poor position on average, to where when you play the card, all of a sudden your opponent just has the answer, and then you exerted 4 or 5 ink and basically did nothing. Aside from that, this list has been performing each and every week. We've seen different versions of this list with Yzma, with Gantu, without Yzma, without Gantu, with Castle, with Library. There's still lots of choices going around, but the version that you see here has definitely been looking similar to other versions that we've covered in recent weeks. So if you're looking for a couple different ideas there, definitely check the description below for our link to our Dreamborn decks. We always have all of our Dreamborn decks set to public once the video goes live. You can go back and look at all of those lists that have been successful in the recent weeks and kind of judge and compare which version that you like the most. Hey guys, each and every week as we continue through this meta report, I have been updating the ultimate guide. This past weekend, I just recently updated the Ruby Amethyst section, even all the way covering into Kendall's performance this past weekend as well. We're going to keep working on it, keep getting as many decks in there as possible, write-ups about those lists, and then eventually, as we get close to the NACC and set championships, we're going to be kind of taking all that information and predicting what our best decks will be for those events. So if you want to get ahead of the curve, definitely check out the Ultimate Meta Guy on Metafy and let me know in the comments below what you've been playing, what you've been successful with, what you've been enjoying so far in the Azurite C metagame. I want to know what have you liked? What has been fun? Do you like this metagame? Do you not like this metagame? Let me know all those things in the comment. Let me know what decks you want to hear about next in the coming weeks as the holidays are showcasing. There might be less tournaments, so I might be doing a couple different things of covering different decks on the metagame. So let me know in the comments below what you guys want to hear about. Let's get back to the decks. So these are the top cut decks through several different events this past weekend. Amber Steel came out the most successful with 8, Ruby Amethyst with 5, Ruby Sapphire with 3, Amethyst Emerald 3, Sapphire Steel 2, 1 Amethyst Steel, and then 1 Emerald Steel and 1 Sapphire Amethyst. Now, we've already taken a look at a few of these decks on this list, but we're going to cover the majority of the rest of them now as well. Although we've seen a very large number of Ruby Amethyst that were played, I believe it was 67 registered Ruby Amethyst decks. Only 5 were converted to top cuts. There were 40 Ruby Sapphires, only 3 converted. Amber Steel had a pretty good conversion rate. Amethyst Emerald was also very high in register, but the turnover to top cuts were very minimal. Sapphire Steel and Amethyst Steel having low registered but pretty okay conversion rates. And then, of course, Emerald Steel and Sapphire Amethyst is probably the biggest. Through the weekend, registered Sapphire Amethyst decks were, I think, 13 or less than, I think maybe it was 9 actually. So with that, converting one of the 9 into a top 8 is a pretty big deal. And we're going to be looking at that list coming up. Ruby Sapphire. I really wanted to highlight this particular list of Ruby Sapphire because it's showcasing some different cards that we haven't really seen in the metagame just yet. Having Basil and Raya in decks is a very interesting note here. Raya is a card that we've talked about a bunch on this channel before. It's one of the cards that I think are in line to be a very successful card within the metagame. And if it's not this metagame, it will be a metagame to come. But the 4 cost 3/3 with 2 lore and the ability of whenever you ink, you can ready another character is a very big deal. It has the ability to ready opposing bodyguards when necessary. It also has the ability to ready your own characters. Maybe you want to protect your Hiram a little bit more. We can quest with Hiram, draw our 2 cards, and then ink and ready our Hiram to keep him protected. Maybe we want to double tap with a Maui or even Maui Half Shark. Both of those cards have the ability to challenge multiple times, remove multiple characters. In the form of Maui Half Shark, we have the ability to get back multiple actions. I think there's a lot of really fun synergy with Raya. It's definitely a card I assume will get better moving forward. Basil, again, is a 1 cost, 2 strength, 1 willpower, 1 lore with support. I think supporting cards like Tipu is a big deal. Supporting cards like Sisu 3 with the human Sisu, it being a 1/1, all of a sudden getting +2 strength to become a 3/1 could be a big deal in removing opposing characters as well. All in all, I do think that this is a very formidable version of this list. It's nice to see a bit of change in diversity. I saw a lot of Maui Sharks this weekend in Ruby Sapphire decks. I stone cold got crushed by one of them, actually. Just Maui Shark at the table, and I was never able to properly interact with it. And the game kind of just ended on the spot once the character was in play. All in all, I do think that there are great things about this list. It's really just showcasing the choice that Ruby Sapphire players have right now and the depth that this deck does have in its card pool. Sapphire Steel here played by Adam to a top 4 at the 72 player event. This is another version of this deck that I think is very interesting. The number 1 card that I want to showcase here is Robin Hood. That's right, the 6 cost, inkable, 4 strength, 4 willpower, 2 lore with the ability to have evasive on your turn. And when it comes into play, if your opponent has more cards in their hand than you draw a card. This is a card that we have not seen in quite some time, since probably chapter 1. But hey, sometimes we just need a way to answer genies, and he's a 4/4 that does that. While, of course, it costs 6, it's still a very straightforward answer to genies, and I think that that is notable. 4, fire the cannons. 3, and then along came Zeus. 1, let it go is our choice for removal here. But we also have 4 Tinks, a Hades. We also have the 7 cost Arthur, King Victorious, which is the 3/6, 3 lore, shift 5, and his ability of when you play this character, chosen character gets challenger +2, resist +2, and can challenge ready characters this turn. So that all of a sudden turns your Grandma Talas into massive cards that can trade in pretty well, but it also, just gives you the ability to kind of take back turns specifically when your opponent is ahead. Having a card like Arthur come in and then allowing a Tinkerbell to make a favorable trade is a nice 1-2 punch. Zimba is another sweet addition, and we've seen the Fighting Prince before. The 7 cost 5/7 with 2 lore, and his ability that when he comes into play, you can either draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards, or do 2 damage to chosen character. There's just a lot of choice in this. This is very much a toolboxy deck. I can definitely see versions of this list being successful. It's notable here that this is not a wheel deck. It is very much a Hiram draw deck. I've also seen versions of this list showcase playing a few docks here and there as another way to kind of draw cards. But this deck also has the ability to have a turn 3 McDuck's Manor. On turn 1, we play our Popsicle. Turn 2, we play Tipo or Sal the Azurite Z. Turn 3, we can drop a McDuck's Manor. And on the play, dropping a 9 willpower card into play with 2 lore on turn 3 can be very effective. It can be very difficult for most players to interact with this card, and McDuck's Manor just might be able to run away with a game, similar to the 1-2 punch of Flynn, Ryder, and Sisu for Ruby decks. Huge shout out to Adam here for sweet finish with a very nice toolboxy Sapphire Steel list. Emerald Steel is a list that we've seen really not evolve much at all recently. There hasn't been any success stories from this list that have showcased anything crazy new in Azurite Z. And we're starting to wonder if this is more of a issue with the metagame for this deck, or just too many cards that are interacting with drawing. the lack of ways to interact with Genie for your Diablos, and kind of meaning that which is kind of making your less Exodia-ish hands playable. So basically, whenever we're just playing a Diablo on 3, whenever we're not shifting Diablo, in games if we're not shifting Diablo and we're just playing it out, we're only getting one draw on average out of Diablo, which is not great for a 3-cost inkable or uninkable 2/2. So obviously, when we can start off strong and have the quick starts with Diablo and draw multiple cards, I think it's okay running in the Genies. But when we can't do that and we don't have the protection from a hidden cove and things like that, we're definitely making it more difficult for our own cards to keep up. All in all, I think this list is still a very good and playable list, and it's definitely still going to be doing very unfair things early when you high roll. It's just a matter of if its more fair hands are no longer more fair than other opposing fair hands. And I think that's the biggest showcase here is that a lot of the things that Amethyst decks have gained from Genie and Elsa are just ways to continuously keep their hand up, make favorable trades, having higher willpower cards that stick around, utilizing crab and things like that. There's just a lot going on for Amethyst decks, and it's really difficult for the Emerald discard decks to kind of keep up and maintain that hand pressure. Having a Lucifer in this list is notable, just another way to like get additional cards out of opposing hands. Also noting that later on in the games, songs being stuck in hands are ones that you want to get rid of anyway. So if your opponent only has a few cards left in hand and you play Lucifer and you make them discard their Be Prepared, that's probably what you wanted anyway. So Lucifer, probably a good nod right now and a really good card for the particular metagame. All in all, this list is still very good. It's still going to cause issues to a lot of different decks within the metagame. It's just a matter of, is this deck good enough to compete with certain Amethyst decks and even certain Steel decks still? I think that you still have a very good matchup in the Ruby Amethyst, but there could be some cornerstone cases that really pose that, hey, maybe we're not as powerful in the Ruby Amethyst because of the addition of Genie, maybe even the addition of Bell and things like that, just having another hardy character, like the 4 willpower or more is definitely more cards that are difficult for this deck to interact with. So we'll have to see how it goes moving forward. But if less players are playing Brawl, then this deck's, 1-2 punch of Diablo and Ursula do start to feel a little bit better in the metagame. Now let's talk about the Samethyst list here, the Sapphire Amethyst. This deck took it to a top 8 at the CCS 2K on Sunday, which was 119 players. I had the pleasure of playing against Chris in round 5 on the feature match area. So if you want to check that match out, you can definitely go and check it. I'm also going to be doing a video where I watch that match back and kind of talk through my deck and the decisions made in that match, along with some of the reasons why I made particular plays and kind of checking on what Chris would do in them. I think that this was a really interesting list. Sitting across from it, not knowing exactly what the list was, and seeing all the different cards in it, definitely kept me on my edge. I think there was a game where he played at Cogsworth, and I was like, "Oh shit! Like, how do I compete with Cogsworth? This is going to actually make the game a little bit more difficult for me." But then I didn't see it again for the rest of the match, so I could have figured out probably in the game. I had thought about it more that maybe he only had one Cogsworth because he definitely never inked it. But that was definitely a card that I thought was very interesting in this particular deck. It's not something that we see too often, but making all of our 4 willpower characters have a resist 1 is definitely pretty damn nice. Donald Duck was another card. For those who are unfamiliar, he is the 5 cost, 3 strength, 4 willpower, 2 lore. And then when he comes into play, you take the top card of your deck. It's just a bigger Detective Mickey that's inkable, and he has 2 lore. Slightly better stats, obviously. But the rest of this list kind of plays through itself. It's just another Amethyst deck. Again, if you really look at the Amethyst cards in this list, other than Elsa Spirit of Winter, which very well could have won him the game and the set if he was able to find it in our matchups. I think he could have probably definitely won game 1. Definitely could have closed out game 2 with it potentially, depending on exactly when he saw the card. But all in all, I think this list was very cool, very sweet, and we're going to be watching it on the channel very shortly, probably towards the end of the week, where we showcase the deck that we played at CCS to a 5-0-2 record, and then, of course, looking at some of these other lists that were matchups that I played against. Huge shout out to Chris here on a top 8 finish this past weekend. So there you have it. This is the week 5 meta report. Lots of, interesting roller coaster rides over the past couple weeks, and after the first 2 weeks, Amethyst Steel was high, then Ruby Sapphire. Now Ruby Amethyst was the most played deck, but Amethyst Steel was still the most successful deck. So you're seeing a lot of like up and down roller coaster rides from the current meta game. So, it's really tough to say. Let me know in the comments what you think about the meta game, if you like it, if you enjoy it. If you hate it, that's cool too. I understand those things. For me, I think it's been great. I think it's been interesting. I think there's a lot of choice involved in deck building. As an example, myself, I put out a 2-day meta report on the MetaFi for myself, my tournament reports this past weekend. Day 1, I played Doc Aggro. I went 0-2. I started into my worst 2 matchups, and it was kind of like, yeah, that's life. That's going to happen. Day 2, I completely flipped the deck to go to a more mid-range control list, and I started 5-0 in that tournament. So, choices that you're making are impactful, but being able to play even within the same ink combination and realistically, like 40 of the same cards just transferring from aggro to more mid-range control is not that much of a difference in the archetype. It's more of just like, hey, I now understand that I can't just get away with doing this because the metagame is not actually predicting the way I thought it would be. There's a lot of those choices going around, and I think that's going to keep happening. So drastic measures, maybe, but in all honesty, if you are looking to support us and also support Joel in his fundraiser and the memorial tournament coming up that you're going to be hearing about soon from Dick Burns on the Team TFM channel, this is a way to do that. We have a new merch line for drastic measures because we're doc enthusiasts and we love it. So definitely, if you want to check that out, that's going to be in the pinned comment below. It's also attached to the YouTube shop. So even if you just go to our channel, you'll see a YouTube shop and you can see it right there. You can click on the link and it takes you to the website. So very, very easy to find that if you want to. Thank you guys so much for watching today. Again, let me know in the comments what deck you've been playing, what deck you've been successful with. If you like this metagame, things like that. If you haven't yet, hit the like button for me. It means a ton. And of course, we are kind of coming toward the end of 2024 here. I'm going to be looking at the first 5 or 6 weeks of the Disney Lorcana Azurite C metagame coming up and really just discussing what are the best plays for North American Continentals and, of course, set championships coming up next month as well. Thank you guys so much for watching today, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.